Hi, welcome back. So this week now we're going to cover the Neo-Analytic and ego perspective of personality. So the Neo-Analytic and ego perspective came from Carl Jung and selfhood. And Carl Jung believed that we are pre-programmed to see and accept certain truths, not only because of our own past experiences, but because of the cumulative past experiences of our ancestors. And so this Carl Jung theory of personality focuses on the interplay between the conscious and the collective unconscious mind, universal archetypes, the process that we go through of individuation, and psychological types. So we learned in the last chapter that Freud believed that our behaviors are dominated by the unconscious mind. So our behaviors and our motivations are consisting of our internal driven instincts that we all have, our primitive needs. But a lot of the researchers that were working in the Freudian area started to recognize a lot of the gaps and limitations of the Freudian theory. And one of them was that the theory does not account for the self-identity that develops from social interactions and conflicts that we have with others. Based on his childhood beliefs, he believed that he had two separate identities. Not only was he a child, he outwardly appeared to be, but he was a wise and cultured gentleman of a previous century. And so a lot of Jung's approach has to do with not only the unconscious, but the interplay between the conscious and unconscious minds. And that there is a process that we go through of individuation based on our social interactions, based on the environment that we're in, and we have universal archetypes. And so this came from the story, which you might have heard of, the story of David and Absalom. Basically, a son trying to rule over his father. You also see in TV shows that children tend to argue with parents or step-parents, and there's a lot of conflict or some sort of drama going on where two people are not getting along, or employees that are against their bosses and complaining about their bosses. And so a lot of it has to do with conflict. It's not only unconscious conflict, but we are consciously aware of this conflict. And so we develop our self-identities from this type of conflict. Jung's definition of the conscious ego is very similar in meaning to Freud's, except that the unconscious ego also embodies this sense of self, this personal identity that's developed around the age of 4. The definition of the personal unconscious, he believed, is that it contains thoughts and feelings that are not part of conscious awareness. It also contains unimportant thoughts, actively repressed information, retrospective and prospective material, and it influences how we react to others. So a lot of Jung's and Freud's theories are similar, except Jung does talk about this personal identity that we do develop. And the conscious self really encompasses that sense of individual differences and identity. So Jung talked about a third component of the mind termed the collective unconscious. And this comprises a deeper level of unconsciousness and is made up of powerful emotional symbols called archetypes. Archetypes are these images that are common to all people and have been formed from the beginnings of human time. They are derived from the emotional reactions of our ancestors to continually repeating events. An example is a rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, or the interpersonal relationships such as mother-child. So the collective unconscious refers to this shared, inherited, unconscious knowledge and experiences that have developed across generations. And they're expressed through universal symbols and archetypes common to all cultures. So an example is that humans share this evolved fear of snakes. So we're quick to notice snakes, we have quickly learned to fear them, and so over time people react to stimuli outside of conscious awareness. And so Throughout generations, our human brain starts to possess this collective unconscious. Jung proposed that there are 4 functions of the mind. One is sensing, so is something there? One is thinking, what is it that's there? So trying to identify the stimulus. 3 is feeling, what is it worth, or what is the value of what I see or hear or sense? And then intuition, where did it come from and where is it going? We also have attitudes, which are extroversion and introversion. These terms are in wide use today, but they're generally understood as being opposite poles of the same dimension. But Jung thought of them as 2 separate and opposing constructs. Extroversion and introversion both exist in every individual, but he believed that one is usually dominant over the other. So extroversion has to do with directing your libido towards things in the external environment, whereas introversion is more inwardly focused energy. So the combination of these 2 attitudes with 4 functions yields 8 possible personality types. Alfred Adler was a physician, a psychotherapist, and the founder of individual psychology. He was considered the first community psychologist because his work pioneered attention to community life, prevention, and population health. His work stressed the importance of nurturing feelings of belonging and striving for superiority. His theoretical constructs involve the inferiority complex, organ inferiority, and masculine protest. He had a lot of disagreements with Freud, which were often heated and intense. Adler quit as president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and he started his own society, which was the Society for Free Psychoanalysis. So he placed a lot of emphasis on origin of motivation. For Freud, sexuality and pleasure were the prime motivators, but for Adler, motivations were much more complex. Adler was much more concerned than Freud with social conditions. So Adler believed that our central core of personality is our strive for superiority. We have a motivation to be superior and maintain self-worth and self-esteem. And so when someone has this overwhelming sense of helplessness due to some experience or event they had, leaving them powerless, they're likely to feel inferior. And so an inferiority complex is this overwhelming sense of helplessness and loss of self-worth when an experience makes us feel inferior. And it can take normal feelings of incompetence and exaggerate them. And so the individual feels as if it's impossible to achieve goals and therefore feels hopeless to try. Now, some people take up a superiority complex. So an individual struggling to overcome such a complex might fabricate superiority as a way of maintaining or overcompensating for a weakness. It's a way of maintaining their self-worth. And so superiority complex is the act of overcompensating for inferior feelings or personal weakness. So Adler believed that we have organ inferiority. So he described this concept as the idea that we are born with some type of physical weakness, known as the weak link, and that incapacity or disease is likely to take root. And so we make attempts to make up for the deficiency in another area. We overcompensate. So he contended that these infirmities and perhaps individual reactions were important motivators of people's life choices that make up their self-identity and personality. So some concepts are aggression drive. So he believed that drives can be directly effective or reversed into an opposite drive. So we have some sort of angry reaction to this perceived helplessness, and we lash out against the ability to achieve or master something. And so aggression is important because it's a reaction that we have to this inferiority complex. The next concept is perfection striving. So in order to make up for these physical weaknesses, we often spend time trying to meet fictional goals, which are imagined future achievements to eliminate perceived flaws. Occupational tasks is another concept. So we choose a career that makes us feel valued in society. We create societal tasks by creating relationships and social networks with people. And love tasks. So finding love, finding a suitable life partner. And so all of these concepts are what help us overcompensate for a weakness or a perceived flaw. Adler also emphasized the role of birth order and personality and individual differences, and that it's related to the inferiority complex and that we overcompensate. So, for example, with firstborn children, they live for a time as the favorite child because they are the only child at that time. And then later on, they learn to deal with the fact that they're not the sole focus. And so this may create the tendency for independence and striving to regain status. Otherwise, the firstborn may become a socially oriented pseudo-parent, helping to nurture siblings and other people. The second-born child is born into a situation of competition because they feel a sense of rivalry with the firstborn child. And so the inability to compete on a physical level may create feelings of inferiority. And so it pushes the second child towards greater achievements, and therefore the second child may end up being more successful. And then the last born children are usually more pampered than any of the other children. And so they are the baby of the family. And so Adler believed that the overabundance of sibling role models might lead children that are born last to feel overly pressured to succeed in all areas of life. And so if they're not able to, they might result in having a lazy, laid-back personality. Karen Horney was a neo-Freudian psychologist, and she focused a lot on neurotic needs. Her research was primarily oriented towards feminine psychology. During her life history, she had conflicting feelings towards her father, was closer to her mother. She married Oscar Horney, and she underwent psychoanalysis with Carl Abraham. She was somewhat detached from her children. Some similarity she had with Adler's theory, she also understood the importance of self-realization and the growth for each individual, and she also focused on social world and social motivations. She was best known for the feminine psychology perspective and this theory of neurotic needs. And so she was more neo-Freudian, sort of a mixture. While Horney followed much of Freud's theory, she disagreed with his views on female psychology. She rejected this concept of penis envy and said that it was inaccurate and demeaning to women. And so her reasons were that women felt inferior due to society. There's this overemphasis on women to secure a man's love, and women live in an environment where femininity is inferior and masculinity is the superior trait. And so women saw themselves as subordinates. And what women really wanted was masculine things as a way to gain power, however, not a penis, more about gaining autonomy and control over society. Horney replaced Freud's biological emphasis with this idea of basic anxiety. And basic anxiety is a child's fear of being alone, helpless, and insecure, and it arises from problems in the child's relations with their parents, such as the lack of warmth, stability, respect, or involvement in their life. So Horney believed that the basic anxieties could be directed at virtually anyone, in which case the internal turmoil would be focused outward on the world in general. And so there's different styles that kids have in reaction to basic anxiety. And so individuals were hypothesized to settle into one primary mode. It's going to either be the passive style, so those get along best by being compliant, or the aggressive style, which is fighting to get by or fighting anxiety. And then the withdrawn style. So people may feel like it's not best to engage emotionally at all, would just withdraw in order to avoid anxiety. The neo-analytic perspective focuses on this sense of self and achieving the self-identity in terms of personality development. So there is the real self concept, which is the inner core of personality. It's what we perceive about ourselves. And it has the potential for self-realization. And it's typically damaged by parental neglect and indifference. There's the despised self, consisting of perceptions of inferiority and shortcomings, which is often based on others' negative evaluations of us and our resulting feelings of helplessness. And then there is the ideal self. So it's what one views as perfection and hopes to achieve. It's molded by perceived inadequacies, and it's based on this tyranny of the should. So the ideal self is really a composite of all of these should haves and should do this and should do that. Anna Freud and Heinz Hartmann were both ego psychologists. So Anna Freud brought the ego more clearly into focus with her emphasis on the influence of the social environment. She maintained the ego's links to the id and superego. And Hartmann is really the founder of ego psychology. So he worked with Anna Freud within the classical Freudian framework, bringing a lot of the same Freudian concepts into play, while also expanding this conception of the ego to deal with the pressures of the real external world. So the transcending emphasis on biological, anatomical, and individualistic, and that it's sort of the interplay and interaction between what we are dealing with in the environment versus our id and our ego. And so he didn't see these as completely autonomous. Hartmann believed that the id and the ego worked in a fashion where they regulate each other. They're interacting. And so because Hartmann accepted the idea that the job of the ego was to help a person function within the world, he also felt that the id, being a tension reduction, pleasure-seeking organism, was regulated by the ego. And so the ego was often able to direct a person to do things in the long run that were satisfying to the id and self-preserving, but in the short term were unpleasant. So the ego not only defends against these sexual urges and tension, but also functions independently to cope with the demands of society. And so the ideas of Anna Freud and Heinz Hartmann form this bridge to our modern notions of the ego and self-identity. Margaret Maurer's most significant contribution to psychology was her theory on separation and individuation. She believed that children exist in the symbiotic phase until they reach about 6 months of age. They also do not see any relationships other than one with their mothers, so they are only cognizant of themselves as one with their mothers. After about age of 6 months, the separation individuation phase commences, and the child begins to distinguish him or herself from the mother, developing an individual identity and ego. The child also begins to develop cognitive skills and master the ability to communicate with others. And so this is like psychological birth that's proceeding according to the predictable pattern. So the normal autistic phase occurs during the first few weeks of life and shows little social engagement. And then you have the normal symbiotic phase, which lasts through the first 6 months of life and occurs when the child gains awareness of caregivers, but has no sense of individuality. And then the separation individuation phase is where the child then begins to develop this sense of self by separating from the mother. Normal symbiotic children form healthy ties with their mothers. They develop empathy, and they also develop this sense of being separate but a still loving person. Symbiotic psychotic children are unable to form this sense of self, and do not have an autonomous being. So they struggle between this need for autonomy and a longing to surrender. And so this could be happening because the child becomes anxious about separating from their mothers and they try to regain closeness. And then this could lead to separation anxiety and abandonment fears. Klein's contributions were that he worked closely with children and developed play therapy, which examined infants' reactions to weaning. Kohut's works was involved with studying narcissistic personality disorder by playing the part of therapist parent with patients. And they were involved with the relational perspective. So they examined the effects of culture on identity, effects of culture on gender, and sexual discrimination. And so this type of research was more clinical, humanistic, and more philosophical. Object relational approaches view the ego as a much more independent entity. There's this concept of the social self, and so behavior that's driven by the social context and the person's social identity. Erik Erikson was a psychoanalyst and maintained that personality develops in this predetermined order through 8 stages of psychosocial development from infancy to adulthood. He moved the psychoanalytic thought beyond childhood, and so not just about childhood, but also in adulthood. And during each stage, the person experiences a psychosocial crisis that could positively or negatively affect personality development. And so adulthood is continuing through this developmental process that's influenced by its own previous stages. In the early life of Erikson, he felt a lack of belongingness and became a wandering artist, but he could not find true meaning in his work. By adulthood, he became fascinated with child development, and he did psychoanalytic training with Anna Freud. He became an American citizen, and he changed his name from Eric Hamburger to Erik H. Erikson, and he developed a theory about personality development. Erikson describes identity formation as a lifelong process where individuals undergo significant change and must take personal responsibility for their lives. So personality develops through a series of 8 stages. Trust versus mistrust is the first stage in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. This stage begins at birth and continues to approximately 18 months of age. And during this stage, the infant is uncertain about the world in which they live, and they look towards their primary caretaker for stability and consistency of care. So trust develops if the caregiver is reliable, consistent, and nurturing. However, if the caregiver fails to provide adequate, consistent care and affection, the child may develop a sense of mistrust and insecurity about the world. Then the second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So in this stage, which is the second stage of psychosocial development, children at this stage are focused on developing a sense of personal control over their physical skills and a sense of independence. If autonomy is encouraged and supported, the child will become more confident and secure in their ability to survive on their own. However, if children are overly controlled or psychological control is applied to children, they may begin to feel ashamed of their autonomy and doubt their own abilities. And so this can lead to a lack of confidence or a fear of trying new things. The third stage is initiative versus guilt. So when caretakers encourage and support children to take initiative, they can start planning activities, accomplishing tasks, and face challenges. However, if caretakers discourage the pursuit of independent activities or dismiss their efforts, children may feel guilty about their desires and their initiatives. So the initiative versus guilt is a particularly lively, rapid developing type of stage in a child's life. And it's a time of vigor of action and behaviors that the parents may see as aggressive. Industry versus inferiority is the fourth psychosocial stage, and it's the fourth crisis involving competence versus inferiority. And this occurs between ages 5 and 12. And so in this stage, children start to compare themselves with their peers to gauge their abilities and self-worth. If children are encouraged by their parents and their teachers to develop skills, they gain a sense of industry, so a feeling of competence and belief in their skills. But if they receive constant negative feedback or they're not allowed to demonstrate their skills, they may develop a sense of inferiority. And so during this stage, the child is coping with learning new information and social demands, and they're getting feedback from others. And so if they get positive feedback, then they'll likely develop industry. But if they're always getting negative feedback, then they're more likely to develop inferiority. Identity versus role confusion is stage 5. And in this stage, typically it occurs during adolescence from about 12 to 18 years. Adolescents search for a sense of self and personal identity in this stage through intense exploration of personal values, beliefs, and goals. If adolescents are supported in this exploration and given the freedom to explore different roles, they're likely to emerge from this stage with a strong sense of self and a feeling of autonomy. However, if adolescents are restricted and they're not given the space to explore or find the process too overwhelming, they may experience role confusion. So this could mean being unsure about one's place in the world, their values, and their future direction. They may struggle to identify their purpose or path, which leads to confusion about their personal identity. So this is the stage where they're making the transition from childhood to adulthood. And it's because children are trying to become more independent and looking at future careers, relationships, families, and living situations. And then the next stage is the intimacy versus isolation. So this is the 6th stage, which takes place during young adulthood between ages 18 to 40 years. Typically during this stage, the major conflict centers on forming intimate, loving relationships with other people. Individuals that successfully navigate the stage are able to form intimate, reciprocal relationships, and they typically form secure attachment styles. Whereas if individuals struggle to form these close relationships, perhaps due to earlier unresolved identity crises or feel rejection, they may experience isolation. And so isolation refers to the inability to form meaningful, intimate relationships with others. Generativity versus stagnation is the 7th of 8 stages. And this stage takes place during middle adulthood between the ages of 40 and 65 years. During the stage, individuals focus more on building their lives primarily through their careers, families, and contributions to society. If individuals feel like they're making progress and valuable contributions to the world, either through raising children or contributing positive changes, they will feel this sense of generativity, which is a feeling of concern for others and the desire to contribute to future generations. This can happen through parenting, mentoring, playing a leadership role, or creative output that adds value to society. However, if individuals feel they're not making a positive impact or they're not involved in productive or creative tasks, they may experience stagnation, which involves the feeling of being unproductive or feeling uninvolved, leading to self-absorption, lack of growth, and feelings of emptiness. And so psychologically, generativity refers to making your mark on the world through creating or nurturing things that will outlast an individual. So this could be even through work, so parenthood or career. So in this stage, individuals often focus heavily on their careers, and meaningful work is a way that adults can feel productive and gain a sense of contributing. In parenthood, it's about raising children, and that's another significant aspect. Adults can derive this sense of generativity from nurturing the next generation and guiding their development and imparting their values. In stage 8, you have integrity versus despair. And so this is a stage that begins approximately at age 65 and ends at death. So during this time, we contemplate our accomplishments, and we can develop integrity if we see ourselves as leading a successful life. If individuals feel they have lived a fulfilling and meaningful life, They will experience ego integrity, which is characterized by this sense of self-acceptance and acceptance of their life as it was. Their ability to find coherence and purpose in their experience. However, on the other hand, if individuals feel regretful about their past or feel they made poor decisions in their life, they may experience despair, which they may feel regret, bitter, or disappointment with their life and a fear of impending death. A related way that modern researchers are helping define identity functionality is by asking people what their personal goals are and what they find important. So, for instance, the phrase personal projects refers to goals or activities that people are currently working on. And so there are specific tasks and immediate goals that motivate people on a daily basis. And there are big projects like becoming a physician and little projects such as not biting my fingernails. So these personal projects are pretty specific and they affect differences in how individuals think and act each day in order to maintain their health. And so Robert Emmons describes more abstract goals as personal strivings. So for instance, impressing friends, or impressing a date that may be satisfied by a number of different behaviors. And so a lot of behavior may be goal and life task oriented. And so life tasks are based on age determined issues. What's your goal at 3 and what's your goal at 7? And so the goals that you had at one point in life are not going to be the same goals that you have 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road. And so they usually are based on what people are currently concentrating on. And so this work is in the framework established by Erickson, and that an individual's tasks are defined to a large extent by the stage of life. So the ideas of Horney and the neo-analysts about the ideal self and shoulds, and the ideas of the object relations theorists have gotten modern personality researchers thinking about multiple possible selves that might exist. And so this modern theory agrees that we may imagine ourselves in different roles and states, but this is seen as a more rational cognitive process rather than one rooted in deeper emotional conflicts. And so Torrey Higgins was a psychologist, and he writes about the actual self, the ideal self, and the odd self. The actual self is the current self-concept we have. The ideal self is our hopes, wishes, or aspirations of what we want to be. And the ought self is the belief about one's duties or roles in society. And so discrepancies between the actual and ideal selves result in chronic disappointment and dissatisfaction. And discrepancies between one's actual and ought selves lead to guilt and anxiety over failure in one's responsibilities. And emotion and motivation may arise out of these discrepancies. And so, for example, if you're pursuing ever greater rewards, you may become sad or depressed, whereas if you're worried about ever greater responsibilities, you will become anxious and neurotic.